She stepped over the gate onto who? Jonathan, let her talk because this will be my last time playing with you and with your people. Because I don't like how you, me and her apologize.
I don't care, you're a liar.
You're a liar.
Okay.
And that's why you went to jail, because you're the liar.
Because I tell the truth.
You're lying. You're lying right now. She just said she came over the gate. She had her leg over the gate and her hands and her arms on me. And I didn't know who the it was. So when I turned around, yes, I moved her back, but I still didn't know why she was on me. That's not in my head like, oh, Jonathan's girlfriend is here and she's getting ready to hop over the gate. For what? She could have just pointed to you and told you to come get her. But no, what you say? I ain't bring sand to the beach. Now am I a liar? Thank you. That's what you did last time too. You played games with people.
I don't know what you're talking about anymore.
Jonathan, you play too many games.
Come on, bring sand to the beach. I brought sand to the beach.
I asked you, why didn't you just have her go around and come in the gate with you?
Stop scrolling because the moment part dropped, the timeline didn't just react. It panicked. This wasn't messy chatter or playful shade. Blueface didn't joke, tease, or bait the audience. He spilled Karlissa's tea calmly, like someone who finally reached the point where silence felt more dangerous than speaking. And that calm, that's what sent shockwaves. When someone exposes details without anger, without theatrics, it feels deliberate, like the truth has been sitting there for a long time. Waiting for the right moment to come out, within minutes, everything changed. Comment sections froze. Old clips resurfaced. Fans started rewatching past interviews with fresh eyes, realizing certain things suddenly made sense. This wasn't new drama, it felt like missing context finally being added. The kind that rewrites the story instead of just extending it. And remember, this was part 2, which means whatever restraint existed before was already gone. The details landed sharper, cleaner, more confident. Blueface sounded done explaining himself, done carrying narratives that weren't his, and done staying quiet for the sake of peace. The timeline didn't panic because of chaos. It panicked because clarity is scarier than drama. Once people start connecting dots on their own, there's no undoing what comes next. Nobody expected part 2 to detonate the way it did, because up until this point, the situation between Blueface and Karlissa had lived in a strange gray area. Fans knew there was tension. They knew there were things being said off camera, things being hinted at in interviews and lives, but nothing had ever been laid out cleanly. It was all fragments, half statements, emotional reactions, carefully chosen words. Part 2 changed that, not by being louder, but by being clearer. And clarity is what sent the timeline into panic. From the moment Blueface started talking, it was obvious this wasn't impulsive. He wasn't reacting to a fresh insult or chasing attention. He spoke like someone correcting a long-standing record. His tone was controlled, almost detached, which immediately unsettled viewers. People are used to chaos from Blueface. They're used to emotional spikes, jokes, sarcasm. What they weren't prepared for was composure. That composure made the tea feel heavier, because it suggested this wasn't about winning an argument, it was about finally saying things he believed needed to be said. Regardless of fallout. As he began spilling details about Karlissa, the timeline reacted in waves. First came disbelief. People replayed clips, trying to make sure they heard him correctly. Then came silence, comment sections pausing as viewers processed what was being revealed. And then came the panic. Not panic fueled by shock value, but panic fueled by recognition. Fans started connecting dots. Old moments resurfaced, not because someone pushed them, but because people went looking. Interviews that once felt one-sided suddenly seemed incomplete. Statements that used to feel definitive now felt selective. What made part 2 especially intense was how Blueface framed his words. He didn't lead with accusations. He led with context. He talked about misrepresentation, about narratives being shaped without his voice, about choosing silence in situations where speaking would only escalate conflict. That admission reframed years of behavior. Silence stopped looking like avoidance and started looking like endurance. And endurance, when it finally breaks, tends to spill everything at once. The tea about Karlissa wasn't just about personal disagreements, it was about control of narrative. Blueface implied that certain stories had been allowed to circulate and checked, not because they were true, but because challenging them felt pointless at the time. That idea landed hard with viewers who watched public figures get defined by voices louder than their own. Suddenly, this wasn't just family drama. It was about who gets believed, who gets to speak, and what happens when one side finally refuses to stay quiet. Reaction videos amplified the tension. Creators weren't screaming or joking, they were pausing, rewinding, and choosing their words carefully. That alone signaled something different. When the internet slows down, it's usually because something doesn't fit neatly into entertainment anymore. This felt personal, and the more calm Blueface remained, the more uncomfortable the situation became. Calm exposure doesn't give audiences the relief of dismissing it as emotional chaos. It demands attention. As details continued to come out, fans noticed how selective Blueface was with language. He avoided insults. He avoided exaggeration. He spoke in ways that suggested restraint even while exposing issues. That balance made it harder to dismiss him as reckless. Even critics had to admit this didn't feel like clout chasing. There was no obvious benefit to airing this out publicly, only consequences. And when someone speaks knowing there will be consequences, audiences tend to listen more closely. The timeline panic didn't come from outrage alone, it came from uncertainty. People didn't know how to categorize what they were hearing. Was this a family dispute gone public? A long overdue clarification? A calculated narrative shift? The lack of a clear label made it more unsettling. Karlissa wasn't just being criticized, her role in shaping perception was being questioned. And once roles are questioned, authority weakens. As the clip spread, fans began revisiting Karlissa's past statements with a new lens. Not to attack, but to reassess. Tone, timing, and intent suddenly mattered more. Things that once seemed straightforward now felt layered. And that reassessment created tension because it challenged beliefs people had already settled into. Nobody likes realizing they may have accepted an incomplete story. That discomfort fueled debate, confusion, and ultimately panic. What escalated the moment further was Karlissa's lack of immediate response. Silence can mean many things, but in this context, it allowed Blueface's version to dominate the conversation. In public narratives, the first detailed account often sets the tone, especially when it's delivered calmly. Viewers speculated endlessly about what her silence meant: strategy, shock, restraint, but speculation only widened the gap. The longer the silence stretched, the more space Blueface's words occupied. By the end of this phase, it was clear that part 2 wasn't just another episode, it was a pivot. The story had moved from gossip to consequence. People weren't just reacting to what was said. They were anticipating what might come next. Would more be revealed? Would responses escalate? Or would this mark a line being drawn permanently? The timeline panicked not because of drama, but because stability was gone. The narrative people thought they understood had fractured. And once a story fractures publicly, it rarely goes back to its original shape. Scream, it clarified. And clarity, when it arrives this late, is often the most disruptive force of all. As the dust from part 2 continued to settle, the panic didn't fade, it evolved. The initial shock gave way to something more unsettling: realization. People weren't just surprised by what Blueface said. They were starting to understand what it meant. This phase wasn't loud or explosive. It was heavy. The kind of heaviness that comes when a story you thought you understood suddenly feels incomplete. Viewers went back, not to argue, but to re-listen. And every rewatch made the implications sharper. What became clear in this stage was that Blueface wasn't just spilling tea, he was reclaiming authorship of his own story. For a long time, conversations around him had been dominated by other voices, other interpretations, other emotional frames. Part 2 disrupted that balance. He didn't beg to be believed. He didn't try to overpower anyone. He simply spoke in full sentences, with context, and let the audience sit with it. That approach forced listeners to confront a difficult possibility. Maybe the story they'd been repeating for years was only half written. The calmness that unsettled people at first became the focal point. Viewers started saying things like, "This feels planned," and not in a manipulative way but in a prepared one. It sounded like someone who'd spent a long time deciding whether to speak at all. That distinction mattered. Impulse can be dismissed. Preparation cannot. And preparation implies necessity. It suggests the silence before this wasn't peace, it was pressure. As conversations deepened, people began focusing less on individual claims and more on the structure of what Blueface was saying. He talked about patterns, about repeated misunderstandings, about narratives forming without his participation. Those aren't accusations aimed at one moment, they're indictments of an ongoing dynamic. And once that dynamic was named, it resonated with a lot of viewers who'd experienced similar situations in their own lives. Suddenly, this wasn't just celebrity drama. It was familiar. Reaction channels reflected that shift. The laughter disappeared almost entirely. Instead, creators leaned into discussion, asking viewers what they noticed, what felt different, what didn't sit right anymore. The comment sections filled with longer posts, personal stories, reconsiderations, admissions of bias. That's a clear sign a story has crossed into meaning. People weren't there for tea anymore. They were there to process. Karlissa's continued silence became a character in the story all its own. Early on, silence felt temporary. In this phase, it felt strategic or at least consequential. Every hour without a response allowed Blueface's version to settle deeper into public consciousness. Not because it was uncontested, but because it was uninterrupted. In narrative terms, uninterrupted space is powerful. It allows a version of events to breathe, to feel complete even without confirmation. Speculation grew, but it changed tone. Instead of asking, "What's the next drama?" people asked, "Is this where it ends?" That's a very different question. It implies finality. It suggests the audience sensed a line had been crossed, one that can't easily be uncrossed. Family issues, once aired this calmly and publicly, don't usually return to private equilibrium. They move into distance. And viewers could feel that distance forming. Another layer emerged as fans discussed accountability. Not in the usual online sense of blame, but in terms of responsibility for silence. Some argued Blueface should have spoken sooner. Others argued he did what he had to do to survive emotionally. What mattered was that people were finally debating his choices with nuance instead of caricature. That alone marked a shift in perception. He wasn't being flattened into a stereotype anymore, he was being considered. At the same time, discomfort grew around the word tea. Many viewers started pushing back on that framing altogether. They pointed out that what was being shared didn't feel like gossip, it felt like grievance. And grievances don't entertain. They linger. That realization made people uneasy because it meant they were no longer passive consumers. They were witnesses. And being a witness carries weight. As days passed, the conversation stabilized rather than faded. The story didn't trend explosively, but it didn't disappear either. It became a reference point. Whenever Karlissa or Blueface was mentioned elsewhere, Part 2 came up. After what he said, knowing what we know now, those phrases signal permanence. They mean the episode has altered how future information will be interpreted. What truly defined this phase was restraint on all sides. Blueface didn't escalate. Karlissa didn't immediately respond. The internet didn't implode into chaos. Instead, everything slowed. And in that slowdown, people realized this wasn't a cliffhanger. It was a turning point. The relationship dynamic had shifted publicly. And there was no obvious path back to where it had been. By the end of Part 2's aftermath, the panic had transformed into something quieter but deeper: recalibration. The audience recalibrated its understanding of roles, voices, and silence. They weren't demanding more tea, they were adjusting expectations. That's often how real consequences begin. Not with outrage, but with changed assumptions. This phase didn't answer every question, but it changed which questions people were asking. And once that happens, the story is no longer about reaction. It's about reckoning. By the time the conversation reached its third stage, The panic had fully transformed into something far more final, recalibrated belief. This is the point where the internet stops reacting and starts deciding. Not deciding who's right or wrong in a dramatic sense, but deciding how it feels about the people involved, and that decision tends to linger. Blueface spilling Karlissa's tea in part didn't just stir discussion. It altered the emotional posture of the audience. People were no longer leaning forward in anticipation of more chaos. They were leaning back, reassessing everything that came before. What stood out most in this phase was how normalized the shift became. The story stopped being treated like a breaking moment and started being treated like established context. People referenced it casually, almost matter-of-factly, as if it had already settled into the canon of what everyone knows. That's a dangerous threshold for any public narrative, because once something becomes assumed context, it no longer needs to be defended or proven. It just exists. And Parta had crossed that threshold. Blueface's silence after speaking became as meaningful as his words themselves. He didn't follow up with extra details. He didn't clarify or soften anything. That restraint read as closure on his end. Viewers interpreted it as someone who said what they needed to say and accepted whatever consequences came with it. That posture carried weight. It suggested resolve rather than indecision. And resolve, even when controversial, often earns a form of respect. Not admiration but acknowledgement, Karlissa's continued absence from the conversation deepened the sense of finality. At this stage, silence stopped being interpreted as a pause and started being seen as a choice. The longer it lasted, the more people wondered whether responding would even help. Many viewers concluded that any response now would only prolong conflict rather than resolve it. That belief mattered more than any actual reply. It meant the audience had emotionally closed the door on escalation. They weren't craving another round, they were bracing for distance. The language in comment sections reflected that shift clearly. People stopped asking, "What happened?" and started saying, "This explains a lot." That phrase is powerful because it rewrites memory. It reframes past confusion as misunderstood rather than unknown. Once that happens, narratives retroactively align themselves. Old moments get reinterpreted. Silence gains meaning. Tension gains logic. And the story stops feeling chaotic, it starts feeling inevitable. Another key change in this phase was how responsibility was discussed. Earlier, responsibility was about blame. Now it was about boundaries. Viewers debated whether airing things out publicly was the right move, but many acknowledged that staying silent indefinitely comes with its own cost. That nuance marked a maturation of the conversation. The audience wasn't trying to crown a winner anymore. They were acknowledging damage on all sides. And damage, once acknowledged, doesn't require constant engagement to feel real. The term tea had almost completely lost relevance by this point. What Blueface shared was no longer being treated as gossip, it was treated as grievance and clarification. That shift stripped the situation of its entertainment value. People weren't watching for fun. They were watching because it felt consequential. And when stories lose their entertainment framing, they gain longevity. They stop trending loudly and start being remembered quietly. Content creators mirrored that evolution. Coverage slowed, but it didn't stop. Videos became reflective rather than reactive. Titles softened. Thumbnails grew less sensational. That change wasn't accidental, it reflected audience fatigue with escalation. The public didn't want more heat. They wanted understanding. And understanding often marks the end of a cycle rather than the beginning of a new one. Perhaps the most telling sign of this phase was how people talked about the future. Not in terms of new revelations, but in terms of separation. Would this be the last time these dynamics play out publicly? Would both sides retreat into distance? Would this mark the end of a long-running narrative rather than its next chapter? Those questions assumed finality, not continuation. And assumption is powerful, it shapes expectation before reality even arrives. By now, the timeline wasn't panicking anymore. It was settling. Settling into a version of events that felt coherent enough to move forward with. That doesn't mean everyone agreed, but it means most people felt done debating. And when the internet feels done, it doesn't need closure. It moves on emotionally, even if the people involved are still processing privately. This third phase didn't explode. It didn't shock. It resolved inwardly. The audience adjusted its understanding, its sympathy, and its expectations. Blueface reclaimed his voice and then stepped back. Karlissa remained silent, whether by choice or circumstance. And the space between them became the story, not a cliffhanger, not a scandal. A distance died, and in public narratives, distance is often the most lasting consequence of all. Before you move on, remember this fame isn't built on moments, it's built on patterns. The rise, the silence, the fallout, and the reset. That's what Fame Blueprint is here to break down. We don't just react to what's trending, we map how influence moves, how narratives shift, and how public stories are shaped behind the scenes. If you stayed through this, it's because you noticed the deeper layers. The calm before the fallout, the shift in tone, the way one moment can redraw the entire blueprint of someone's public image. That's exactly what we focus on here. So if you want smarter breakdowns instead of surface drama, like this video, drop a comment with your take, and subscribe to Fame Blueprint so you never miss the moves that matter most. Understand the fame. Follow the blueprint. Understand the fame. Follow the blueprint.